So welcome everybody. Great to see everybody. More no telling, I'll just say a few quick things and then we'll have a formal introduction from Professor Wainwright. Welcome to the 2017 Taaffe Lecture. Our colloquium series is sponsored very generously by the John Nelson Endowment, and that helps us to bring guests to the department, and we're delighted to be able to do that. And today we welcome Heynen from the University of Georgia, and as I say, Joel will present a formal and more learned introduction. I just basically want to kick things off and welcome you. It's good to reflect on this event, how we got here, the fact that it's made in honor of Ned Taaffe, my dear friend. And I'd like to welcome visitors so they can kind of see what we do. We have these marquee speakers events for Taaffe and Robinson a couple of years. And these marquee events mark a notable aspect of the department's history, of people who got us where we are today. Ned, it's no secret, he was an intellectual powerhouse, a Chicago Democrat who no doubt would have a lot to say about the current political scene. A great debater, a real force, an expert in transportation, and by the way, also in climatology, and he served some time as a weather forecaster. So it's great to remember and recognize his contribution. He did shape the department. I want to thank our Visiting Speakers Committee for organizing this event, and to sort of give a shout out to the new energy now that Joel will chair that committee, and they already have some great plans for terrific future events. We think this is a nice event in the history of the department and also a marker for the year, and we will have others going forward and expect great things. So Joel, I'd like you to come up and give some swag to Nick. I know you got some gifts there. Good man.
Part of our ceremony with these so-called marquee events is that the speaker has to carry home these red bags full of stuff. And, in the olden days, we would unpackage everything one by one and embarrass the speaker with all his gifts, but I'm not going to do that because I like Nick a lot. But I just want to show the nicest part of the whole thing, which is Nick gets to carry home a plaque with his name emblazoned on it to honor his wall in his office. And that's not the only place. It's also going, your name will go on the wall down the hall, along with, you should check it out before you go, many of the most august names in the history of geography from the 20th century who have been previous Taaffe lecturers in our department. Before I get to Nick, I just want to say a warm welcome to everybody, particularly our visitors from out of town who are considering coming here next year. The lecture series is a really vibrant part of our life in the department, and as the new chair of the Visiting Speakers Committee, I want to make a quick announcement or two about what's going to happen next year. So if you did come here, this is what will be going on. The committee had a handover of the chair recently, and we finally met this last week and talked through our process for next year, and I have a couple of exciting announcements to make for everyone. First of all, we're going to double the number of visiting speakers next year from 2 to 4, so we'll have 4 speakers. If everything works out, 2 in the fall, 2 in the spring. 1 each for each of the major research areas of the department, from spatial analysis, human, physical climate, and human environment. And 2 of those will be marquee, 2 non-marquee. So next week will be the week when nominations are solicited, so this is your heads up. Those of you who are in the department, please think about it over the weekend who you would like to bring in next year. An email will be coming probably Monday morning with the details on how to nominate, but it's going to be pretty simple. You'll basically send in a name with an explanation of why you want to bring who you want to bring. One other new quality, however, next year is that the committee has decided that next year we're going to try having a theme for the entire year. So all 4 speakers will speak on different aspects of one theme, and the theme is climate change. So next year all 4 speakers will, in some way or another, talk about climate change. And in this way we're going to try to unify, in a loose way, the speakers, and to advertise them and market them as a cluster, as a quartet. And so one big poster all across campus for the whole year, in the hope that we can increase turnout from other parts of campus. So we'll try it next year, we'll see how it goes, and if the theme thing works, we'll stick to it and have a different theme for the following year. So, with that said, watch out for the email on Monday, get the wheels turning about who you would like to nominate. But now it's my pleasure to introduce Nick Heynen, a dear friend of mine who I promised I would not introduce in a long-winded way, so this will be brief. Nick completed his PhD in geography, human geography at the University of Indiana in 2002, and is presently a professor in the Department of Geography at the University of Georgia. where he is, among other things, also the director of the, let me see if I get this right, the Interdisciplinary Center on Conservation. Okay. Integrated Conservation Graduate Program. All right, good. There's an acronym, don't ask me what it is. But imagine a big interdisciplinary center concerned with the study of environmental conservation. Nick runs that in addition to being a full professor in geography. He's one of the leading scholars in geography in the area of food politics, anti-hunger politics. He's worked extensively on struggles around black liberation in the United States. And I would say, but his most long-standing core interests have been in the area of urban political ecology, for which his work is best known. Nick has done an absolutely incredible amount of work as an editor. The labor he's contributed to the discipline as an editor is honestly, I'm not trying to, it's not false praise. It's probably unparalleled in my generation, our generation of scholars. He has edited 5 books. He was editor of the journal Antipode for a number of years, and he's presently the editor of the Annals, which handles a ridiculous number of manuscripts, I'll just say that. And in addition to all of that, he's about to become the editor of another journal, but I won't say anything about that because it's still kind of top secret. And he was the editor of the University of Georgia Geographies of Social Transformation book series. And in that role had his hand on something like 30 different published manuscripts, an untold number that didn't quite get published in one way, shape, or form. So, as I said, the unprecedented amount of editorial labor. But apart from all that, I want to underscore again the contributions of his research in his own right, and aside from all that, he's an absolutely wonderful person and a dear friend. So please join me in welcoming Nick Heynen, this year's 2017 Taaffe Lecture, again, toward an abolitionist project.
It is an honor to be here. As Joel said, I did my PhD close to State Open, and was here for an East Lakes meeting. And this is the only department that I had considered going to get a PhD other than the department that I was at. I came here and did a visiting thing with Kevin Cox and did a readings with him. I drove over every month for a semester and we talked about stuff, and then ultimately I think we both decided it was better off for me to stay in Indiana. So, but it was quite an important moment in my life. So thanks again for having me. Thanks to Joel and the committee and everyone. It is special. So this is a new project that I'm going to talk about today. It's like brand new. So that might be evident a few times. When I moved from Wisconsin to Georgia, I was quite vigilant in my mind that I wasn't going to get into the Civil War. Right? There's like all these stereotypes of white men with big beards in my mind about like the Civil War history, and so it's interesting for me then that I start off with a slide of Sherman in Atlanta burning it down, because it's actually to the Civil War and that history where I've been spending a fair bit of time recently and trying to think about it in more contemporary ways around property politics, and trying to think about the uneven racial development that has kind of gripped much of this country, but especially the South and the southeastern portion where I'm doing some empirical work right now, and kind of trying to think through a deep history of what racial capitalism has been, is coming to be, and thinking about ways of ameliorating some of these quite destructive tendencies. There are 2 moments that I want to start off with. This is the first one. When in July of 1864, Sherman's army comes into Atlanta, kind of burns down the whole city, except for 400 buildings that are left standing. And in so doing, fundamentally transforms the urbanizing logic of the Southeast, right? Fundamentally transforms the urbanizing logic. And not just in not in the city, but the southeastern region more generally. So there's like a regional urbanization aspect that I'm really interested in. And we can see through the second kind of moment that I've been thinking a lot about, Sherman's March to the Sea, which occurs immediately following the sacking of Atlanta, which you can see the map of the various routes. And we can read this as another example of what Marx talked about as primitive accumulation, or what Harvey has referred to as accumulation by dispossession. Or we can read this in a whole host of ways. But one of the things that it did was it really kind of upended property relations and set into motion a very distinct racialized set of property relations that still come to bear on this region and many of the things going on. The reason why these two moments are so important is that it's through them that we see ultimately the realization of the abolition of slavery. Right? It's these two moments that kind of crescendo to the end of the U.S. Civil War, and so the fact that they happened in my backyard was one of the reasons why, when I got down there, I realized I had to take it seriously. I couldn't ignore it. It's just too important. I'm still not doing any reenacting or anything like that, just to be clear. And so this is a picture of Atlanta after the sack. And Atlanta in this region kind of had two fundamental episodes that lent its emergence. And the first one was capitalist transportation infrastructure. Atlanta's first name was Terminus because it was the end of the railroad line into the southeast. And the other one was colonial displacement. So we see the forcible removal during the 1830s of two indigenous nations, the Cherokee and the Creeks. And we see the extension of this rail line. These two kind of cataclysmic things start off this process of urbanization and put into motion a series of land politics. And I've been reading, and as have many of us perhaps, Cedric Robinson's book, Black Marxism, in a different way as I've gotten into this history. And so one of the things, this is a book from 1983 that's kind of had this revival since his passing away 2 years ago. One of the things that he says in here kind of helps me think through these politics and these property dynamics. He says, the violent event of colonial aggression and its corollary of Indian slavery had already transmuted in Franklin's neo-nativist American mind into a relationship of supplication secured by an economic rationale. Indeed, the dependence of newcomers on natives already reversed. He goes on to say, the curtain of supremacist ideology had by now begun its descent on American thought, obscuring from the historically unconscious generations of descendants of colonialists and later immigrants the oppressive violence and exploitation interwoven in the structure of the Republic. So this ever-presence of white supremacist logics and the way in which it plays out in property relations is always there, is part of the argument here, right? So again, it suggests to me what Laura Polito has been talking about is this kind of really taking these deep histories much more seriously, because they don't ever vanish. They're always there, and we're just not taking them on. So all of this said, the way that I really got to the Civil War, and I've just been building this up, was here, right? It was over the last 3 years when I got down to Georgia trying to make sense of this new world that I was living in, and eventually coming to Du Bois, and having over the last 3 years invested a fair bit of energy. Like, this is about a 750-page book, and you don't just pick it up and kind of breeze through it. It's like any major schools of thought. And so one of the things that's so interesting about this book and this project, Black Reconstruction, and so it's very important to point out that this book is published in 1935. Okay, that's the date that's going to matter in this intellectual history. One of the ideas that he develops in this book is the notion of abolition democracy. Abolition democracy. And what Du Bois says is that slaves fighting for their freedom against the Confederacy come to realize that no matter if abolition happens or not, they're still going to exist within a society that was premised upon white supremacist logics. So just because slavery goes away, all the institutions of society are still going to have been generated through this idea. And so what Du Bois argues for here is a total recalibration of democracy, right, which he terms abolition democracy. And that's a pretty powerful idea, right? We can see that playing out now through all kinds of contemporary episodes politically throughout North America, throughout the United States. That white supremacy and the logics therein are still dictating in very kind of concrete ways everyday life for many people. And so what I've been trying to do, and I've written a few little things recently, is work through the idea of abolition democracy toward the idea of abolition ecology, to try and put some of these property dynamics into conversation with the kind of political ecological work that many of us in here are interested in and are thinking about, but have been doing so, at least in my experience, without paying attention to this African American kind of history. So as important as Black Reconstruction has been for me, I've actually stumbled onto something that has been even more important as I've been working toward this notion of the abolitionist commons and thinking about common property relations. And that's this, which is a little known. In fact, I can find no other citation by a geographer of having engaged with this, which makes me feel, smart or lucky, or really lucky. And so this is published in 1907, and what's really important about this is it's published while Du Bois is living in Atlanta. He's teaching at Clark Atlanta, and he's kind of cobbling together various research stints to think through a lot of the ideas that would ultimately come out of Black Reconstruction. Okay? So here's a copy of this book. And in it, he starts to theorize and think through notions of cooperation. Fundamental thinking about notions of cooperation. So on page 24 he says, "It was the church too, or rather the organization that went by the name church, that many of the insurrections among the slaves from the 16th century down had their origin. We must find in these insurrections a beginning of cooperation, which eventually ended in peaceful economic cooperation." Right? So he ties economic cooperation in the 19th, 20th centuries to these insurrectionary, revolutionary politics of abolition. He goes on to say, "We find that the spirit of the revolt, which tried to cooperate by means of insurrection, led to widespread organization for the rescue of fugitive slaves among Negroes themselves, and developed before the war in the North and during and after the war in the South into various cooperative efforts toward economic emancipation and land buying." So the uptake of property relations in Du Bois starts to play out. And this book is fascinating because there are all these tables. There's all this data in here. Look at the data. Right? There's data. And a lot of it's around Georgia. So I've started to try and string together, some of these ideas of abolition democracy, of his kind of forming of ideas of cooperation in here, and kind of trying to work it together. So when I say this is new, I haven't figured all that out, but what is the best thing that I've figured out in like the last 4 years of thinking comes out of this report, right? Because like when we're talking about this, and we think about what Robinson said, we have to always be vigilant against how white supremacy is there, right? Because we know it's there. We know it's here somewhere. We just can't see it quite yet. So it's here where on one day, sitting I think I was walking in my office reading this, and was dumbfounded by the first page. First page, as many people do in dramatic fashion, he starts off with 3 quotes, right? 2 of them by this guy.
Wow.
So, you don't know who this guy is. This guy is Frederick Ratzel, who many people would say is the grandpappy of environmental determinism, right? So Du Bois is quoting Ratzel and doing so in positive, embracing ways. So the 2 quotes, the first one, "Among the great groups of natural races, the Negroes are the best and keenest tillers of ground." The second, "The market is the center of all the more stirring life in African Negro communities, and attempts to train him to culture have made the most effectual start from this tendency." So land and market, right? Tied up. And Du Bois is like, yeah. Let's use this German geographer. Okay, now, so the chronology matters. This book is published in 1907. This book is published in 1904. He dies in 1904. Right, so there's this thing when you die, evidently. People start paying more attention to your work, right? So there's a buzz. So the buzz factor here matters in how intellectually Ratzel gets taken up. But that's not all, right? Because Du Bois had spent time in Germany, and that's where I thought, well, that's how he came across, maybe he's hanging out with Ratzel. Nope. Gone through his time in Germany, didn't spend any time with Ratzel. So why this quote? Like, how does this work out? So then I just start setting my rules. I start looking every which way I can. And as I said, I've been investing in Du Bois, so I have the shelf of stuff, right? A lot of his correspondences have been published. And I find the magic bullet. And here it is, right? I'm going to unveil the best thing I've maybe ever found out. Right here it is. It's a letter. It's a letter sent to Du Bois in 1905. Clark Wisely. Anyone know who that is? Me neither. Me neither, no. But then I started digging. I started digging and digging and digging and digging. And it turns out that Wisler worked at the American Museum of Natural History as a curator in ethnology from 1902 to 1907. He got his PhD in psychology from Columbia. Decided, psychology, I want to do other things. So he starts thinking about anthropology and ethnology. So Du Bois writes a letter to the curator of the museum, just thinking he's just like a random guy, looking for, as we see here, looking for, upon your return I find a letter from you asking for a list of the best works on Negro anthropology and ethnology. Right? So he suggests Ratzel, History of Mankind. As we dig into Wisler's history, what we find out is he was central to the eugenics movement. He was central to the scientific creation of racism in this country. He plays a central role later on in life. So there's this really deliberate kind of effort to put this in motion in very particular ways. And it is fascinating to me. I find it just flat out fascinating. But even beyond the granular, what it does is it shows us the way in which intellectual history is malleable, it comes and goes, and the way in which we ultimately are able to attach to society, nature society, through some of these things, requires a really kind of granular, fine-toothed effort. So when I initially started thinking about the commons, I did so in the way that I think most people do, right? Which is like through white dudes, right? Through Marx, Polanyi, and Thompson, who are oftentimes associated with the most popular telling of how we think about property relations, how we think about the commons as an idea. And the thing that's probably more important about their theorizing about the commons, and again, I still am very supportive and still especially have equally as much of E.P. Thompson's work on my brain right now as I do Du Bois. But all these stories are drawn from European history, right? Going back to the 1600s, land enclosure movement, German forest lands, English countryside enclosure, right? So all the theory that comes out of these minds are coming from a very particular kind of geographic historical moment, which matters, right? As geographers, we know that time and space matter, right? So, we can't detach the theorizing around the commons from these folks to that European history. That's not to suggest that it's white supremacist or whatever, but it is Eurocentric, right? By definition, it's Eurocentric given the history that they're coming out of, and that in itself is an important recognition as we think through in the Southeast and we try to work through Du Bois. How do we put some of these things into conversation with contemporary property politics? I would say, beyond the thinking here, there's one other person that looms large, maybe larger than them for many people in the discussion of the commons. Well, I had a lovely opportunity to speak with Darla, who's I think not here because she had a big fancy meeting to go to about someone who we both interacted with when we were at Indiana, Lynn Ostrom. So Lynn's work on the commons is up there in terms of some of the most important and sophisticated discussion. But likewise, and I feel weird critiquing Lynn Ostrom, but likewise, her theorizing of the commons comes from a particular place and a particular mindset, which is namely game theory. Right? So if we want to try to apply some of this discussion to what I'm thinking about in the Southeast right now, going back to this deep history to 1865, it breaks down. It breaks down in a pretty bad way. So if we take, for instance, the 8 kind of takeaways from this book, right, the 8 principles of managing the commons according to her kind of game theoretic approach. The first, define clear group boundaries.
2, match rules governing use of common goods to local needs and conditions. 3, ensure that those affected by the rules can participate in modifying the rules. 4, make sure the rule-making rights of community members are respected by outside authorities. 5, develop a system carried out by community members for monitoring members' behavior. 6, use graduated sanctions for rule violators. 7, provide accessible, low-cost means for dispute resolution. And finally, number 8, build responsibility for governing the common resources in nested tiers from the lowest level up to the entire interconnected system. That's a whole project just to work through those 8 and show how this doesn't work when thinking about the U.S. Southeast or the U.S. South going back to 1865. But I'll just go back to number 3, right? So let's think about slavery, abolition, Jim Crow, full in effect. Number 3, ensure that those affected by the rules can participate in modifying the rules. All right? None of this is possible. None of this is remotely possible given the institutional structures that Du Bois was talking about that are still largely in play. So what all this suggests to me is that there is a great value in investing in other ways of theorizing these property relations. And so this is where another fairly formidable person comes into play in ways that is I feel, quite privileged to have been able to capture. Who knows where they were on March 26, 2009? No one? If I didn't have it on paper, probably. So I was in Las Vegas. So were many of you, by the way. Because I was at the AAG.
Oh, yeah.
And I was on a panel, big long table. Scott Pruitt was sitting here. I was sitting here, and Clyde Woods was sitting here. Neil Smith was sitting there, and then a bunch of other really smart people. Right? But Clyde Woods is the person who I need to highlight right now. Right? This was a panel that Scott and I had organized on the 25th anniversary of Neil Smithsonian development. And what Clyde said fundamentally blew me away, and continues to blow me away today. What was unfortunate about this is that we put together a special issue of a journal called New Political Economy that Clyde was not able to participate in and has since passed away. I had a tape of it. So I was able to capture what he said and have transcribed it. And so this is a little bit lengthy, but I think it's important given the setup that I'm going through here, and you're not going to read this anywhere else. Okay? Clyde says, what I'm going to do is talk about 3 areas that I think have formed the foundation for an extension of the book. First, there was a discussion of the commons. Part of the analysis, and probably I'm misreading it, is that as capitalism extends outward, the plague of locusts destroys one commons after another. But I also think that it's in this process, it's in creating the commons. The commons is not just a pre-capitalist formation, it's creating the idea by the people who are displaced by this process. It's creating the idea that there are new alliances to create new commons. But it's also creating new commons themselves on the margins, in the swamps, as they say in New Orleans, but through a number of different ways by working class communities. New commons were created based on enclosures, but also the understanding of the rationality of capitalist and chaotic nature of capitalism itself, particularly for racialized communities. There is this constant search for a new common. And because they are also enclosed, spatially enclosed, even within these enclosures created by capital, they create commons within these enclosures. Right? So it gets a little MC Escher. He goes on to say, so a plantation can be a commons, a ghetto can be a place of refuge and resistance, affirmation. So this commons is created both theoretically, but also in the fact by the very process of the extension of capitalism and the original extension of its reproduction. So when you look at African American communities, which is one of the original working classes of the world, they are constantly not only recreating commons and intellectually theorizing about commons, but also developing intellectual traditions and new traditions of geographic thought. And so this idea that there's just one geography is limited. Last thing he said. I think there are multiple systems of geography, multiple traditions of geography, and they particularly come from these racialized communities as they encounter capitalism and these enclosures of necessity. So there will be an African American tradition in geography that is old. Okay? He goes on and on and on. And this book is, you can pre-order it right now. Little plug.
Please.
UGA Press. He was working on this book when he passed. Laura Polito and Jordan Camp took on the manuscript as it was, finished the book. It should be out in May. I've had the privilege of reading it about 7 times now, and I highly recommend you put it in your cart. See, what we can do here is we can move through the way in which this intellectual history of property relations and the commons that has come out of these white or European traditions, now building on Du Bois, although he doesn't explicitly talk about here, he has elsewhere, start to build new possibilities for thinking about these things. Now, one of the things that I think is really important to point out, and you got to be a little geeky to figure this one out, in this very narrow way I am, Neil Smith only uses the word commons once in Uneven Development. It's in the second afterword, and it's in a total throwaway sentence. Right? It's about an example of a High Plains buffalo commons. It's just a throwaway kind of rhetorical flourish. So the fact that Clive is reading the commons into the discussion of the social production of nature and the social production of space is in itself, I think, hugely important recognition. Now we could quibble and say, as Clive does when he started off, maybe I'm misreading this. But I don't think that's the case at all. Right? I think he's drawing on a whole other experience to think through theory that for many of us has always been very abstract and disconnected as a book. And Neil himself agreed with that. Okay? So here you start to see the start of a new way of thinking through these politics. So we can then go back to my 2 first moments. We can go back to Sherman. And on January 16th, 1865, he declares Special Field Order 15. So has anyone ever heard that? Special Field Order 15? This is the document right here where the phrase 40 acres and a mule comes from. Okay? So what Sherman did was he demarcated this land, North Florida to South Carolina, as land for freed slaves to have to restart a new society. Right? And he put it upon them. The details are all in here. It starts off, reserved and set apart the settlement of Negroes now made free by the acts of war and the proclamation of the President of the United States, the islands from Charleston south to the abandoned field rice fields along the rivers for 30 miles back to the sea and the county bordering the St. Johns River. So it gets into a lot of detail. Okay? What we see by June of 1865, roughly 40,000 freed slaves have taken up land on 400,000 acres of this land and started to figure out what abolition looks like through the commons land property. Right? So this is a total way of thinking through empirically, historically, this idea of the commons coming out of this of some of these theoretical bits. What is really important in this story is that what's his name? Sorry, there's a guy's name that's not Secretary Stanton, who is Lincoln's Secretary of War, goes to a meeting with Sherman in Charleston with 20 African American community members, and they ask, like, okay, you're free, what do you want to do now? And try to pose a serious question about what does abolition look like. And one of the folks in attendance there, a man named Reverend Garrison Frazier, says, the way we can best take care of ourselves is to have land and turn it and till it by our labor. That is, by the labor of the women and the children and the old men, and we can maintain ourselves and have something to spare. And so again, the land politics is central to Reconstruction as it started to unfold. Flash forward now. Flash forward 152 years later. I've been spending a lot of time on this island, Sapelo Island. And what I've been trying to do is connect this long history in contemporary empirical ways. So what's going on here is this island, 97% of this island is owned by the state, 3% of it is not. There is one community on here called the Hog Hem community, which has historically been the home of Gullah Geechee people, who were 4th, 5th generation from the slaves that worked this when Thomas Spalding bought it as a plantation to grow sugar cane and to grow rice. And they talk about property politics in the most fascinating ways, as you would anticipate, given their ancestral connection to this island. And so I won't go into a ton of detail here. All I'll simply say is, as I've been trying, so the UGA's Marine Institute is also here, which I'm a faculty affiliate of. And what we've been doing is trying to bring folks together and negotiate access to a 25-acre parcel which we will be growing in common sugarcane, a variety of sugarcane that has been recreated in a lab at Clemson that is a variety that was grown on the plantation prior, right? And so what the Gullah-Geechee folks are going to do is they're going to market the hell out of this. And it's very complicated, and it's super, like, you know, like, are you sure you want to do this? And, you know, is this not reminiscent of, but, you know, it's not my call. I'm helping make connections because I have that capacity to do so, but it's their vision. Okay. And here's a contemporary, so here's Hog Hammock. All these other communities have been upended through the last main owner, a guy named Reynolds of the tobacco family. There's been all kinds of interesting details over the last decade of tax increases up to 500%, displacing people, so there's lots of land displacement. And here's a snapshot, like the branding of the purple ribbon sugarcane and the rum and the syrup that they're already starting to market and think through. So again, it's just trying to think through contemporary property politics in these connected ways. There's another example that I'll just quickly talk about. When Sherman and his army leave Atlanta and go to the sea, I mean, think about, this was a major military operation. So there are Union troops all over Atlanta, and they have these massive encampments, right? As they start to pull up and leave, what it does is it creates the possibility for reuse of the land where the encampments were. So one of the things that happens is that we see this massive in-migration from the rural countryside to Atlanta by freed slaves. Again, trying to figure out what does abolition look like? What do we do now? So let's see, from 1860 to 1870, the population of Atlanta doubled from 14,000 to 33,000. It's a pretty major population growth in a decade. We see that the African American percentage in Atlanta in 1860 rose from 20% to 45% between 1860 and 1870. So again, it's not just a pretty massive population growth, it's a heavily African American population growth. So where are these people living? Where are they going? How is this working? Right? These are the details that we don't often think about when we're trying to think through the Civil War or abolition. And so one of the places, the first major place in Atlanta where African Americans are allowed to resettle comes to be called Shermantown. And it was an encampment that as Sherman left, he said, you all can settle here. Okay? Shermantown ends up, and there's lots more that I could say about it, I won't, but there's the press releases that I've been finding and kind of archival materials about the formation of churches, of schools, of collectivity, right? And collective institutions that you can start to see the kernel of a new society starting to form. So it's one of 3 communities within Atlanta that are the first where African Americans settle. What is so fascinating about Shermantown is today it goes by the name of Sweet Auburn. Does anyone know Atlanta? So Sweet Auburn is where the Ebenezer Baptist Church is, where Dr. King used to preach, which many people would say is one of the most important African American communities in the world. Right, if we think about this historically as related to its connection to the Civil Rights Movement and King's influence in that. So you can draw this historical thread now from Sherman, the burning of Atlanta, abolition, property politics, all the way through to King and some of these kind of ongoing issues. So how do we get this into the present day, other than what I just said? Actually, and this is the newest part of this project, there has been an effort by the city of Atlanta through this man, Chris Norman, who is the director of the Fulton County City of Atlanta Land Bank Authority, right? To figure out property mechanisms to take property that has kind of fallen out of productive use, as many city folk and policy folk talk about it, and bring it back into productive use. Productive use, I'll put that in quotes. Unpacking the history of this, it goes back to 1991, where 2 men, Bill Bowling and John Abercrombie. Bowling is working at the Atlanta Community Food Bank. Abercrombie is working with Habitat for Humanity. Are trying to find land in Atlanta for anti-hunger politics and affordable housing policies. They meet a guy named Frank Alexander who starts to generate legislation that helps give a policy backing to the land bank and to allow this mechanism. It doesn't do anything for a very long time until very recently, in which they've kind of recreated the mission statement of the land bank. And so just to give you a sense, the mission of the Fulton County City of Atlanta Land Bank Authority is to facilitate the transformation of the city and the county into a vibrant community by returning non-revenue generating, non-tax producing or blighted property to an effective utilization status in order to provide market and affordable housing, public space, new industry and jobs for the citizens of the city and county. Now this language makes it sound different than the conversations that I've been having, which is essentially this is for affordable housing, this is for public green space, this is for creating not a commons per se, and this is the way that often we talk about it in loose context, but opening up property relations for more greater access. And some of the legislation that I've seen is very clear about it, property not being able to transfer for profit-generating entities in and around. So when we create a composite, when we think about this long story, this is my last slide, just to kind of try to think about how the reframing of Du Bois' discussion of abolition democracy creates new horizons for thinking about racialized property politics, for thinking about property politics that aren't racialized. I mean, I think this is another thing. This is not just about African American politics or property, right? This has potential ramifications for thinking about the whole United States, all North American property politics in particular ways, which I think is important. And it's through this kind of historical approach that some of these environmental contradictions that I've not really spent too much time talking about come to light. But more importantly, and again, the thing that I think is the most interesting to me are these moments in this intellectual history where you see Weisler contributing in kind of sneaky ways to Du Bois's work, and then you see Clyde Woods, on the other hand, reinterpreting something that, as geographers, if you haven't yet read it, maybe you won't ever read it, but Neil Smith's Uneven Development is an important book for many of us. And that reinterpretive moment, again, in a book that was first published in 1984, which was his dissertation, is very exciting, right? It suggests the kinds of possibilities that we all have at our hands, especially if you prospective students come to OSU. All right, thank you very much.
I have a question for you. So I'm intrigued. I haven't read W.E.B. Du Bois's Black Reconstruction in America, but I'm intrigued by the ending date, 1880. So most people in Reconstruction 1876 was a stolen election, Rutherford B. Hayes, and stuff like that. So what happened in 1880? I mean, why did he choose that endpoint, do you think?
I could totally try and BS you on this.
Okay, go ahead. Let's hear it. I'm enthralled.
No, actually, it has to do. No, I don't. I can't remember. To be honest, I've been focusing on. I mean, I've read that. I should be able to recall that. I think it was just both he and Eric Foner's work on Reconstruction used a few years after, just I think to contain that kind of immediate aftermath of Reconstruction. So it's not the formal period, but to say that it doesn't just stop on a dime, and so we want to keep thinking through it. I'm sure there's a much more sophisticated explanation in both of those books, though. It's a great question.
Rutherford B. Hayes,
Yeah.
in Ohio.
Oh! There it is. I will no doubt look that up tonight when I get back to my hotel room. I carry with me always a large PDF version of it.
Call me anytime.
Okay. I'll text you. Yeah. I'll give you a long answer. Oh, sorry. Yeah. Oh, yeah.
I'm curious, you've talked a couple times about the Shermantown and then also this area on the coast of Florida, which is just kind of for resettling freed slaves, and I'm wondering if there are any parallels around some of this talk about commons with Liberia.
That's a good question. I don't have any idea. I don't know. I mean, Du Bois has a connection to Liberia and spends time. Obviously, we know this. We know that his archives are there. but I have never thought for a second actually about what the property politics translation there is. This is nice. No reception for me. Write these down. Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah. Oh, right.
Maybe something just to fill me in and educate us more. I think you've delved deeply into this intriguing smoking gun, so to speak, of how boys found his way to Ratzel. Could you maybe elaborate on that? Do you think Weisler was deliberately planting ideas and so on?
I mean, so I think that the way ideology works is obviously quite interesting. I think many of us would agree. And one of the things I've been trying to talk myself away from, I mean, this is very exciting and it does feel like a smoking gun, right? But that 3-year window, I mean, it's not until Semple kind of comes in and uptakes, translates a lot of Ratzel that actually the language of environmental determinism becomes such a thing. It's not until the Holocaust and Hitler and the Nazi uptake of that idea that we start to demonize it, right? So I think the politicization of Ratzel and the fact that there's a pretty important time lag there, I'm sure we're all using ideas right now that we're going to regret down the road, right? How they might get taken up. I mean, it scares the crap out of me when I go to bed at night thinking about citing Joel, what that's But I think that there's something about the temporality of ideology and its life world and how we, 2020 retrovision, right, on these things. It seems clear now, but there's no reason to suppose anything in particular, other than the fact that we do know that Weisler was involved in it. But the other thing is that Ratzel was a big deal then, right? For all kinds of people. I mean, you can see it in the annals, we can see it everywhere, that there was a very kind of legitimate utilization of Ritter, Ratzel, and these folks in non-kind of contrarian ways, non-critical ways. Huh?
Yeah, it was great, thanks. I was wondering if you could maybe comment on this sort of alternative spatial history of this part of the world, and for people like Kevin Cruz who talk about, for example, the sort of concentration camp-like demographic capture of African Americans downtown, and the sort of long history in which that's actually kind of a way to contain and keep sequestered black populations by virtue of transportation networks and letting quote-unquote Atlantic go black as the white working class families moved out in the mid-60s.
Well, I think that's the bigger story, right? I mean, I think Cruz and lots of other folks kind of telling of how white supremacist logics have continued to stay maintained. That's why Black Lives Matter is such an important thing right now, because they're pushing back on some of these logics. And I think, it's weird, like when you read this stuff, you just take it for granted. Of course. I mean, of course they're doing this, right? They've always been doing this. So I mean, that is my comment, is that Cruz is telling the narrative that when you interview folks, in Georgia of African American descent, it's like, of course, like my whole family has, for generations, have had to deal with this kind of crap. And the fact that some pundit starts talking about it as a new thing, it's always been here. And I think that's part of this ever-presence of this discussion, which is precisely what Du Bois is talking about in 1935, right? Trying to recapture the need for something called abolition democracy. If abolition democracy had kind of been operationalized, we would not have the ability for Cruz to say what he says. Arguably, hopefully, ideally.
Yeah, I think Ratzel showing up here is kind of interesting, and I'm remembering that Ratzel makes one, maybe two tours of the United States in a sort of de Tocqueville kind of style, traveling around making sort of ethnographic style descriptions of things. And if I remember from the book that I read of his, it's been a couple of years, but he spends quite a bit of time in the South, and it would have been during Du Bois' lifetime as well. I'm wondering, if would there have been other overlaps there, even if they're not meeting, but would there have been other circulation of ideas between the two? After that,
I have searched very little, as exhaustively as I have tried to figure out this connection, and I can find no other overlap of being in the same place. I mean, again, I'm not saying no. I just said I haven't been able to find it yet. I mean, going through all the biographies, going through all the archival kind of references I have all three correspondence volumes. There's just no mention of Ratzel anywhere else other than in that letter.
But it's fascinating, and I'm going to keep looking. Maybe not tonight, but as I proceed.
Yeah, I was also interested in this moment, and especially, I mean, so I guess I wasn't quite sure what you were taking from it in terms of the implications for Boyce's work. And there's a way in which it's like, oh, isn't it ironic that he has, you know, racist ideas at the beginning of his book, or come explicitly racist ideas. What was his name, Weisler? You know, being a scientist in 1903 and being a eugenicist is completely unsurprising, right? I mean, that was just the zeitgeist, I think, in many ways. You know, and I've been slowly learning how much so through some of the work that I've been doing. So, but I wonder if it's also one of the implications could be about the ways in which these ideas that we look back at, like environmental determinism, as being, you know, handmaidens of colonialism and of racism, were being actually used in very different ways and that had, you know, different kinds of potential in them. And I wonder if there's some of that lesson rather than just the lesson of how ironic.
Yeah, yeah, no, I think that's, I mean, if we think about like path dependency of ideas, I mean, you know, my interpretation is now stuck in some ways, right? But I think absolutely. I mean, so there's a book that I've not yet read, but I found that talks about Weisler's role in the eugenics movement and around conservation. So
Well, that's another area,
Yeah.
conservation.
So thinking about how the language of conservation comes to be, and evidently he played some role there. So clearly that's going to get back to land. I just don't know where that thread goes. So I'm certainly open in this. I mean, this is part of the story. You know, last week at Dope, Paul Robbins gave a talk about John Muir and kind of the absence of Native Americans in most of Muir's work. And so Paul and I we got to talking about these different kind of literary trails and what they tell us and what they don't tell us. And it's easy to start making quick assumptions about what this says and what it doesn't say. And so what I'm going to try very hard is to not do that. So I think your point is really good. Keep digging.
I know some of your other work, you listen to how everyday people talk about complicated problems like climate change. And I'm wondering how the communities you work in talk about changes in property relations or what they want. I assume they don't talk about abolition of commons, but I'm wondering if they talk about reparations or if they link it to mass, like just kind of mass incarceration. Like what's in their minds when they talk about what they want?
White people still in their land, still, over and over again, for always, never, more the same. I mean, the tax hike thing, so that got taken up by the New York Times, and it actually became a big deal. It was all over national media. And it was this same kind of thing where in the community, they were just like, why is everyone so surprised? You know, like, of course they're trying to steal our land. They've been doing it forever. And so there's, you know, like they get bored talking about it. You know, I mean, what they'd rather talk about is how do we do, what are the politics that we can enact around this? How do we organize? You know, and this is at a time when Hog Hammock has, you know, 40 people living in it, right? And there's this threshold point where a lot of white off-island rich folks are starting to buy property on the island, despite the fact that it's a very complicated kind of landscape to do so. But, you know, like there's almost a recognition that their community is done. And so it's like, it gets really depressing and sad. But it's also, it kind of helps me double down when I don't want to drive 5 hours over to Sapelo and say, okay, let's go have a meeting. Let's figure out if there's anything at all we can do here. And again, I'm not like taking any credit. I mean, they're doing it. It's just for me to get out of my lazy ways.
Yeah, the way you recounted it makes it sound that abolition is this key moment where African Americans say, wow, what do we do now? How can we imagine a property under abolition? But I imagine there would have been many ideas already in circulation. For example, from the escaped slave communities and even the Great Dismal, or communities that were established along the Underground Railroad that would have had prior experiences about forming this type of community, and that there would have been networks that would have exchanged and shared ideas about how to live in those ways. In other words, it didn't begin So can you sort of speak to how the moment of abolition is in fact in some ways not really a, I mean, the,
It's
you know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I think it's the articulation of these politics that is the point as far as the intellectual history goes, right?
Okay.
Like, we can look at Tubman, we can look at Douglas. I mean, that's where I started with Douglas. I started with Frederick Douglass when I kind of, at some point, right? Because I was trying to figure out, like, how does abolition matter for property politics? And, you know, there are lots of really interesting stories, especially around the Underground Railroad. How property gets taken up and thought through strategically as far as mobility, right? So for mobility scholars, I mean, you know, like it's incredible to imagine some of those discussions that could be had. So I think what I'm trying to do here is, in my own head, make sense of how this gets taken up. Because again, Du Bois is like one of the most important scholars of his time. We see the NAACP formation, we see the Crisis, which is, you know, the magazine that is for African Americans thinking about politics of a higher class, right? It becomes a central conduit for exchange of ideas and knowledge. Right? So, but I think you're absolutely right. There's a lot more that like, predates and is probably just as, if not more sophisticated. You know, it's just hard to tap into. Sam?
Could you talk more about the property politics of that land bank in Atlanta, and thinking about Neil Smith and the production of underdevelopment as a tool to steal land through gentrification and those processes? It feels like the land bank is kind of trying to, in the moment before the land gets snatched up, get it and make economies, but doing so still using the terms of blight as something that legitimizes.
Yes, I wholeheartedly agree and feel super uneasy as I have been talking to Chris about this because of the language of the market that gets taken up, because of the language of blight, because of the kind of the same sorts of language that we hear being dislodged, you know, for very strategic gentrification kinds of ends. I think it's only in the history of how this has come to be in this city that I start to feel some degree of like political solidarity with these folks, right? And having sat in Chris's office and kind of, you know, like been naive, right, about it, and him kind of walking me through and kind of like winking at me as he's telling me like, we got this. Like this is all about kind of a particular kind of low-income African-American politics that is going to have to do certain things, and there might be a downside, but we're going to make this happen. So Kasim Reed, who's the mayor of Atlanta, has just granted a large several $million-dollar budget to the land bank. And again, if you know anything about land bank, Kasim Reed, he's quite progressive. I mean, he's not perfect by any means, but his politics around property have been quite, at times, important in terms of thinking through the fact that, I mean, a lot of folks are getting priced out of the city. Atlanta right now has the highest suburban poverty rate in the country, and it's in the top. I mean, it's because, I mean, it has been a minority majority city for a while, and that's starting to change because of some of these dynamics. So everyone sees this as a necessary and maybe the only kind of mechanism, which I think is really interesting, because I don't think about policy. I'm not good thinking about concrete things. I'm like, you know. And so this is forcing me to think through, how does this actually happen? Like, who votes on this? So I've been going through and the archives and piecing together how this became legislation at all. I've now talked to Frank Alexander, who wrote the legislation. It's you know, like there's a lot there to think through, but I think you're absolutely right that there's the real possibility that it could go sideways, just be as corrupt as.
But it actually seems really exciting if they're getting a budget from taxing.
Yeah, no, I mean it's a very exciting moment in the land bank's history. I mean, like so Detroit's land bank has I think there's like some crazy amount of thousands of properties that it has uptake. And the application of land banks to cities, there's a great kind of variability to that, and the policies that they're geared toward. The fact that Atlanta uses the language explicitly of affordable housing and green space differentiates it from all of the land banks that I've ever found. And again, this historic history around, I mean, Jimmy Carter is from Georgia. Jimmy Carter starts Habitat for Humanity with other partners. So again, there are these lineages kind of playing out underneath this.
that I think are important. Okay, thank you.